We are delighted to welcome you to this session of the 15th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India. This session is presented by Rajasthan Patrika. It is our pleasure to present today Looking for the Enemy, Bette Dam and Christina Lam in conversation with William Dalrymple. Though the primary enemy of Western forces for 2 decades, the Taliban was a force of which they knew little, and their founder and leader, Mullah Omar, one even less. Dutch investigative journalist Bette Dam had decided to track down the reclusive Taliban chief, in the course of which she learned the Taliban inside out, made a startling discovery regarding Omar's whereabouts, and unraveled the misinformation plaguing global forces. Her book, Looking for the Enemy, is the culmination of a 5-year-long pursuit, the story of Afghanistan's mountains, war-ravaged valleys, and the Taliban, now once again at the helm of one of the world's most fragile states. Christina Lam is among Britain's leading foreign correspondents and best-selling author of Farewell Kabul, From Afghanistan to a More Dangerous World, Our Bodies, Their Battlefield, What War Does to Women, and I Am Malala, the girl who stood up for education and was shot by the Taliban. In conversation with historian, author, and festival co-director William Dalrymple, pioneering journalists and voices in the discourse surrounding Afghanistan come together for a necessary session on an urgent state of current affairs. Bette Dam is a Dutch investigative journalist who made a career working in Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq. She is currently a lecturer at the Sciences Po University in Paris on the subject of Afghanistan. Dam is also the author of A Man and a Motorcycle, How Hamid Karzai Came to Power. Christina Lam is chief foreign correspondent at the Sunday Times and a best-selling author. She has reported from most of the world's hotspots, and her dispatches with the Mujahideen fighting the Soviet Union saw her named Young Journalist of the Year within 2 years. She has since been awarded Foreign Correspondent of the Year 5 times and the Prix Bayeux. Lam has written 9 books, including Farewell Kabul, The Africa House, and The Sewing Circles of Herat, and I Am Malala. Her latest book, Our Bodies, Their Battlefields, was shortlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize, the Orwell Prize, and the New York Public Library Bernstein Award. William Dalrymple is one of Britain's great historians and the best-selling author of the Wolfson Prize-winning White Mughals, The Last Mughal, which won the Duff Cooper Prize, and the Hemingway and Kapuscinski Prize-winning Return of a King. His most recent book, The Anarchy, was longlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize 2019, among others. A frequent broadcaster, he has written and presented 3 television series, one of which won the Grierson Award for Best Documentary Series at BAFTA. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, the Royal Asiatic Society, and the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and writes regularly for the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, and the Guardian. In 2018, he was presented with the prestigious President's Medal by the British Academy for his outstanding literary achievement and for co-founding the Jaipur Literature Festival. Please feel free to send in your comments by typing them in the comment section. Do follow our social media handles to get notifications of the upcoming sessions. Please tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2022 and tag at Jaipur Litfest. Ladies and gentlemen, Looking for the Enemy, Bette Dam and Christina Lam in conversation with William Dalrymple.
Well, please welcome to a very special session of the Jaipur Literature Festival, where we have 2 of the world's most intrepid foreign correspondents, both of them, though, perhaps surprisingly at this moment, in the safe sanctuary of London basements rather than the Ukraine, where I think certainly Christina will be heading out this week, and Bette probably not far behind her. Both Bette Dam and Christina Lam have very bravely covered the full width of the conflict in Afghanistan and have seen the country through good and bad times. And we're going to now do a session which homes in particularly on the Taliban, a movement that few people know as well as these 2 women, We're going to talk about Mullah Omar and the rise of the Taliban. And then we're going to discuss the extraordinary return, which surprised, I'm sure, neither of these women, but certainly took the rest of the world by enormous surprise last August. And we're going to look forward to what the future may lie. Obviously, things are very grim in Afghanistan now. The focus these days is very much on the Ukraine, but the suffering and the hunger and the chaos in Afghanistan is only just beginning. And Christina, who's just returned from there, filed some incredibly moving and tragic reports from there as recently as a fortnight ago. So I'm going to start by asking Christina, who traveled with the Taliban in their very earliest days, to paint a picture of how on earth this group of then simple students originally came to power. And Bette, please feel free to hop in if there's anything you want to add at any point, but we'll come to you and focus in on Mullah Omar in about 5 minutes otherwise. Okay, over to you, Christina.
Thanks, Willie, and thanks everybody for joining at a time which is a very scary time, I would say, for Europe, for the world, for the people of Ukraine in particular. And today's talk actually has some connections, because many people have said that what emboldened Putin to act in Ukraine was the defeat, the very humiliating defeat of NATO by the Taliban last summer, and the inability to do anything about it. But I also think that there is another Afghan connection, which is that the last time that Russia, or then the USSR, mounted a full-scale invasion of a country was Afghanistan in Christmas 1979. And I started my reporting career not quite as long ago as that, but in the late 80s, covering Afghanistan and the incredibly brave resistance against the Russian army, or the Red Army at the time. So when I see all these pictures from Ukraine of ordinary people, dentists, cafe owners, going and collecting weapons to fight for their family and their homeland, it reminds me very much of that, except that in Ukraine, of course, we're seeing a lot of women fighters, which we did not see in Afghanistan at that time. But we did see how a very patriotic, very proud people could drive out a much superior military power. So I think, you know, that is a lesson that it seems that Putin hasn't learned, but we will see. And that defeat, of course, ultimately by the Afghan Mujahideen after nine and a half years, forced the Russian army to leave. They lost about 15,000 soldiers, but many more Afghans were killed. I think we don't know the exact figure, but around 1 million people died in that fighting. So it took a very, very heavy toll. And I really hope we don't see anything quite as bad as that again. But the fact is that fight had a significance, as does Ukraine now, much beyond Afghanistan, in that it was very much the last fight of the Cold War, and that the Afghan resistance was supported by a huge alliance of different countries providing weapons, funding, training, never actually, for the most part, crossing over into Afghanistan, but sending a lot of things. So again, a similar situation. And the defeat really was a major contributor to the collapse of the Soviet Union a couple of years after that withdrawal. So I was covering this war in the late 80s in what some Afghans would say were kind of the glory days, as they were managing to drive out the Russian fighters. But as we all know, what happened when the Russians left, the world basically started ignoring what was happening in Afghanistan and saw it just as an Afghan war. that they weren't interested in. I was very shocked because I was very young and naive, and I couldn't understand how all these people could go almost overnight from helping the Afghan resistance to just suddenly not being interested at all. Of course, we all learned later the lessons of doing that, but that's, I think, another subject. So what happened when it left was, far from the Afghans then being able to kind of move into Afghanistan and take over, the resistance really all started fighting each other, and it became really unpleasant. I covered the first fight after the Russians left, which was the Battle for Jalalabad in 1989. And I mean, thousands of people were killed in that fighting, and it was ordinary civilians being caught between the Afghan government and the Afghan resistance. But then you had all these different groups fighting each other. We've later come to refer to them as the warlords. And it was really messy and really sad. And what had looked like a kind of great victory just really disintegrated into enormous amounts of fighting, people controlling different fiefdoms across the country. It was very difficult to drive along a highway because there was so many checkpoints that were all controlled by different people that were all demanding money, and lots of terrible things were happening. Children were being picked up and raped, and it was a huge mess. And
Christina, just to interject that, do you think that this sort of decentralization and the way that different areas of Afghanistan have sort of gone off and ruled themselves by default in the absence of strong government is in a sense the norm of Afghanistan, that the moments when you have strong centralized authority from Kabul running the whole of the country like clockwork are in fact very, very few and far between, and have only happened a couple of times in Afghan history?
yeah, I think that's true. It is a very decentralized country, and that's what we saw then, that it really, you know, but in that case, it was often these fiefdoms were really small. I mean, you'd just be traveling 2 miles and then you'd come to another checkpoint that was someone else's area. And people got very fed up with it because women were being abducted. People couldn't move their goods because they were having to pay so much. So amidst all of this group emerged who basically said, we're going to sort this all out, which later became known as the Taliban. And I spent a lot of time in Quetta in Pakistan, and I started traveling with a group who at that time called themselves the Mullahs Front.
We should perhaps point out this is not a claim many people alive today can make. The Quetta has been effectively out of bounds to almost every journalist for at least the last 20 years.
It's a shame because it's a fascinating place and quite beautiful, actually. And so I traveled actually on the backs of motorbikes with this group, and it was at the time run by somebody called Mullah Muhammad. I traveled with somebody called Mullah Borjan and his fighters. And they told me they were just really fed up with the breakdown of law and order, and that they were trying to sort all of that out. But they were a small group then, and actually, I mean, it seemed quite chaotic. Like we were traveling around Kandahar, Maiwand area, and kind of launching attacks even in the center of Kandahar with really, it seemed very little number of people and very few weapons. So it was
one
quite
quick
scary.
question before we hand over to Betty for the next stage in the stories. Did you get the impression that this was all controlled out of Pakistan, that the ISI had a big hand in this, or was this something which was self-generating and genuinely Afghan?
This was before. It was much more local in the area. It was people really fed up with what was happening, and it was later that it became I mean, I believe that this was the genesis of the movement, and Mullah Omar then was living in a place called Sangisan near that area. And so it later became a movement, and later it ISI got very involved and saw it as a way, I believe, a vehicle to do what they wanted to do. But I don't believe that it was started by ISI. I think they saw it as something they could work with.
And was it, how much of it, again, another story that you hear a lot about this, about the Taliban, is it came out of the madrasas, and particularly came out of Korak, the madrasa halfway between Peshawar and Islamabad?
Again, that was a bit later. I think that they later went, because it was a small movement when I was traveling with them. And to be honest, they often talked to me about how they might try and bring back the king of Afghanistan, which was very different to their later views. And the fact that they had a Western woman traveling with them with no problems also, shows that their views about women were quite different at the beginning to what we later came to understand as the Taliban's beliefs, or saw, not just understand.
So Betty, do you want to take the story up at this point? And we'll have you for a bit.
Yeah, sure. I think just briefly on the Ukraine situation and the calls also to send weapons to individuals or ask people even from London to go there and fight, for me is also very concerning. Of course, it's very disappointing that we are again in a war. It's very disappointing from the Western part of the world that diplomacy didn't work. We saw that as well in Afghanistan, that diplomacy didn't work, which I try to hope that once will work. But the fact that these weapons are going and that these groups take up their arms, I think, William, there would have been no Mullah Omar if that would have not been the case in Afghanistan. There was absolutely no future for boys, men, young men like Mullah Omar in the hierarchy of the Afghan society. And that he and his man, I will come to that, they needed total destruction. And that was also the moment, and in Sangisar, like Christina says, where they just basically gamble. There's a gamble, which is not like a heroic story of Mullah Omar saving raped women from the hands of the strongman. It was overall, I think the story of the Taliban was so much more practical, almost pragmatic, in the sense that the drugs mafia, or the businessmen who were very powerful from Quetta, but originally Kandahari or Helmandi, they couldn't live. Their people became unhappy because of the civil war, of the destruction. The roads were closed, and you see here and there that they try. There's another attempt to rise up a little bit outside of the city, Kandahar, and the same Haji Bashar is trying, and that's a very important name, maybe even more important than Mullah Omar in the early days, who is a big businessman who's known by the US as having like drug labs all over the world and sending drugs into the US and Europe, and he is panicking, and so he is basically saying, okay, our upper elite has been outlawed. We have done it ourselves. Tribal leaders have no reputation anymore. If one tribal leader stands up, the other will kill him. And so we need to fall back on these poor guys with the Quran in their hands. Let's see if we can use them. That is a little bit how I see it. And that's what happened. I managed to get the witnesses of the first meetings, a couple of meetings, 3, I think, where Haji Bashar is organizing these meetings in Sangisar, I think on quite a local level. I leave it open that Haji Bashar, as an opium trader, is probably involved in the drugs world of Pakistan, also very corrupt situation at that time. And who knows, that's where the ISI comes in. But I see from the witnesses I spoke to, it was just a little try, like, can we open one road? And because of the combination of a big businessman and this mullah, I don't know, they were just lucky, really. Like they first went to Mullah Nakibullah, a very big leader who had a lot of weapons from the Rabbani government, because he was part of that. And Rabbani surrendered to them. that changes the situation. And basically, Mullah Omar follows the lead of Haji Bashar. The people who I spoke to, they call it the Haji Bashar movement in the early days, not so much the Taliban.
And was Haji Bashar and Mullah Omar from the same tribe? Were they all? I mean,
not at all.
Not at all.
Let me put it differently. The leader of Mullah Omar, who was a young person, like 18 when the jihad started, the leader, Nek Mohammed, was a Nurzai. And Nek Mohammed brought Mullah Omar to Sangisar early on in the jihad because they lost their game in Uruzgan.
And Mullah Omar, correct me if I'm wrong, was a Hotaki Gilzai?
Yes, indeed. And then Haji Bashar is Nurzai, a very, very important family in that Sangisar area, maybe the most important family. And Nek Mohammed, the lower level, like from Uruzgan, lined up with the Nurzais, and that's why Mullah Omar was close to that powerful network. And Mullah Omar was a mullah who had fought with Haji Bashar, but nothing more than that. It's really not that he had a career as a commander, for example. It was just they needed a clean, almost innocent face to stand in front of the tribalness and the civil war and the sadness of the war. And they managed. It basically, as a snowball, they rolled through Kandahar and managed to get important people. In the first meeting, it's beautiful to see that the participants say, no, we need Mullah Bojan as the leader. We need Mullah Rabbani. Those were the big mullahs had fought themselves at a high level in the jihad. And then Haji Bashar said, no, these are too prominent. We need just a low level person. And then we have less resistance. And he managed. And unfortunately, he has been in the prison in the US for a while. I tried very, very hard to speak to him, but it's impossible. But his story is important to understand more about this.
People often forget, and I think you write about as well, is Hamid Karzai was involved right at the beginning.
His father
Hamid
very
Karzai
quickly
surrendered.
The family very, very quickly aligned with this. Also, like Christina said, because the family believed, like many other, like Alokosai and Popolsai and the Duranis, thought that they in the beginning wanted to have the king back, and that was an argument for them to look it up. But there was also a tribal argument for the Karzais because they were losing from a big rival. The Karzai family is full of rivalries. There's been a lot of killings back and forth, and that pushes and pulled their politics also post 9/11. But I feel we don't have enough eye for that. But I think in that time, basically the fact that Amir Lalai, a local, like a Kandahari leader, was so powerful that Abdul Wahab Karzai just thought, okay, let me gamble too. Which he did. And
just to give a bit of background here, the Karzais at this point are landowners outside Kandahar.
Yeah, he is also expelled. He is expelled by the jihad, William, because he lost basically from the biggest rival in the Popolsai, which was Amir Lalai. And there's an example that Amir Lalai slapped Abdullah Karzai in the face and said, "It's now me, and give me your weapon." So this is very, very a good, interesting example of the power play in that family. And the moment Amir Lalai lost from the Taliban, he fled, and Hamid Karzai became more prominent with the Taliban. So it's all very pragmatic. It's not so ideological.
When I traveled in those early days with the group, Hamid Karzai was already with them, and in fact, one of the trips he traveled with me too. So, and then later on, he, of course, became the spokesperson for the Taliban at the United Nations, sort of lobbying for them.
But he didn't, in the end, Karzai didn't become the ambassador for the UN, also because they didn't get the position in the UN, which they found a big disappointment, as we see today. Well,
I'm talking about before they actually took power. I mean, he'd split them by then. He split with them, he always says, because of ISI's involvement, that he saw it as becoming much more a Pakistan movement.
yeah, I find it sometimes difficult to speak to Karzai and really figure this out, what went through his mind, honestly. But yeah, I must say
He told me that it was just all about just trying to stop the chaos. That at this point, Kabul is being shelled from the Panjshir, that there is sort of bloodshed everywhere, and he saw them as the only viable option for bringing peace, which I think is not untrue.
Yeah, and I also think it was not Karzai's choice not to go ahead with the Taliban. It was the Taliban's choice to not go ahead with Karzai, honestly.
Right.
And Karzai would have gone further. Yeah. And that's, of course, the whole, my book is also a little bit more than I thought about the ISI influence of the Taliban, which is, which I try to nuance a little bit.
So when do you think the ISI did get heavily involved in the Taliban?
I think the ISI wanted to get involved, William, pretty early on, because first of all, Mullah Omar didn't need the ISI so much. He had like the money from the Bashars and the other businessmen who just suitcases full of it. There was no problem. This was the future thing immediately. Also, Mullah Omar was working with President Rabbani at that time. Rabbani was as happy as the people in Quetta because they were all having the similar enemy, which was Hizb Islami. And Hizb Islami was known to be very close to the ISI. Now, I'm not an expert on Hizb Islami, but I just copy paste this. I don't see that in those early months that there's ISI, but then soon enough, when Mullah Omar becomes more powerful than Rabbani becomes afraid, splits away, and Mullah Omar goes off on his own with the Haji Bashars and all the people around him. And then you see the visits of the ISI openly. The people write about this, and they really, really want to have a relationship with Mullah Omar.
You have to remember that, I mean, all of these people had long, even quite small commanders, had long relationships with ISI before it became controversial, because ISI were the ones actually in charge of distributing the arms.
And handing out American money, we should point out at this point.
So, that had been going on for 10 years. And so lots of people on the ground had links with ISI officers. I think ISI really got involved with the Taliban in a big way when Benazir was prime minister and General Barber was the interior minister, and he started seeing them as people that could actually they could work with and try.
We should say here also, because this is an Indian audience, that this is exactly the same period the ISI gets heavily involved in Kashmir too.
Yes.
And the Kashmir Jihad become an ISI operation.
Yeah.
Yes, because they exactly had seen how well it worked in Afghanistan and thought we can do the same. We can create proxies and send them to Kashmir.
Anyway, moving on. So at what point do the Taliban sweep over and become this sort of tidal wave, Bette?
I mean, it's not been an easy road overall. After Kandahar and Uruzgan, the expelled strongmen also involved in drugs, like Haji Bashar was, they gather in Helmand, and there it clashes heavily. And it's almost, and you see Mullah Omar in total panic. He races off to the airport, and he actually is so in panic that he even suggests to fly a warplane himself, which is of course insane. And we see that he's losing important friends. He's becoming very doubtful about his belief, and is constantly referring to Allah punishing him for what he's doing. Anyway. So there are setbacks. There's a setback in Herat as well. But if you look at that part, to the western part, there's a lot of setbacks. But actually up north, Wardak and then Kabul he takes that basically 2 years after his first meetings in Sangisar. He takes Kabul, a city he completely distrusts, a city he really thinks of like there are heathens who have no idea about Islam, who have to be educated, and who need strict laws. to get back on track. That's how Mullah Omar sees it. He also speaks about that in my book.
And what stage does Kabul fall to the Taliban? What date?
April.
Of
No, sorry, Osama bin Laden arrives in April. It's September 1996. Yeah.
And so yes, so let's move on. We're heading towards the end of this our time. Let's move on quickly to Al-Qaeda. What point do Al-Qaeda jump into this?
Yeah, I think as much as I try to nuance the Pakistani influence, I also try to portray a picture of that is a little bit more complex in relationship to Osama bin Laden. And that is because it was an uninvited guest. And I think in combination with the Taliban really wanting to have a friendship with the West, they were hoping that the West would compliment them for what they had done, because not any group was able to bring quietness to Afghanistan, and they tapped themselves on the shoulder for that and said, well, the Islamic state was always the plan, no? It was the plan of the jihad to bring an Islamic state, and now we give it to you on a platter. And it comes with strict rules, it comes with restrictions of women, and many jihadi leaders were already restricting women dramatically during the jihad that was supported by the US. So it was very confusing from the Taliban side. And I think that they wanted to deliver Osama bin Laden, William, you probably know about this. They were much more Western, and what you see is that failed. And I think the explosion of the Buddhas, now I go very fast, but I don't want to be unnuanced, but the explosion of the Buddhas is a middle finger towards the West, much more than an ideological decision. I am against idols. And that next level, when Osama bin Laden on his own, without Mullah Omar knowing, is involved in that 9/11, and Mullah Omar doesn't know about this. That is, yeah.
So that's a crucial thing to ask both of you. Maybe Christina first. How much are the Taliban involved in the whole run up to 9/11? Or are they genuinely in the dark?
Oh, I think they were not involved. I mean, I always felt very strongly that we were fighting the wrong enemy in a way after 9/11 with the Taliban. They were not involved, but they were, he was their guest. They are very much part of the Pashtun culture, where you protect somebody that is your guest. He may not have
or
been
specifically
by
sanctuary.
Yeah. And I think, ISI was also very involved in that. And instead of, we know that when the ISI chief went to talk to Mullah Omar about handing him over, that rather than try and persuade him to do that, he was offering to provide them weapons and to fight. So
do you think the ISI had any advance warning of 9/11?
I don't know.
I don't know.
No,
Bette, do you have any view of that?
I don't want to get into that. I learned one thing. I'm not going to talk about things I did not really investigate, especially in this. I think it's maybe again, going back, since we are finishing, I think going back to the Ukraine situation, I think what I did is like something that is again very sensitive and very criticized, is that I spoke to the enemy. And that's the enemy of the US, to be more specific. And I really think the book turns it upside down. The book shows that after 9/11, we could have had peace. The book shows, and now more and more people like Steve Cole jump on this narrative, say like we could have had, the war was unnecessary, William. It was unnecessary if we would not have gone along with the US emotion of 9/11, which is difficult. I agree that, but I think we need to re-educate as journalists. Also today, we need to really speak as much to the Russians as we do to the Ukrainians. And there can be one bad, and it can be, but maybe it's not the journalist who needs to judge first. That's really what I learned, and I don't know if you agree. But I feel I learned so much, and I learned so many opportunities for peace by talking to
Well,
women.
one thing, just to interject there,
Yes.
obviously for very good reasons, the Taliban are considered to be an incredibly dark moment in the history of Afghanistan. Were there any positive sides to, I mean, did they successfully bring peace to Afghanistan and stop the fighting? Was there anything else that was remotely a plus point to their rule, or was it an entirely dark, medieval and negative chapter?
Well, I think at the beginning, people were very relieved because it had been such violence and such a terrible time. But, it didn't take that long for them to start, showing a different side and imposing a lot of these restrictions that we come to associate with them.
And so,
brutal behavior.
Brutal behavior. And what was the reason, do you think, that it changed? Just because power corrupted, they came to power and they began to throw their weight around, or was there any reason that it moved from being a movement aiming to bring peace and bring warlords to heel to being the oppressive regime that it's remembered as?
But it's an ideological movement as well, and so once they were in power, there were certainly plenty of people there who wanted to use it to impose their ideological beliefs. And that's, to bring it up to date, it's the sort of situation that we're in now, except this time I think what's different about the Taliban in power at the moment is it was quite a monolithic group in the first time they were in power. This time it's a number of factions together, and some of those are very ideological, some are not. There is definitely the group that were more involved in the negotiations in Qatar, the sort of political Taliban, people often refer to them, who think that they do need to have a more inclusive government, that they should let women work and girls go to school, because otherwise they're going to be a pariah state again, as they are at the moment.
But the impression one gets is that those guys have been totally sidelined, that all those negotiators have never been seen again.
Well, that's the problem. And some people would argue that the West, by not engaging more with the Taliban, are actually driving them more towards the hardliners, because the others are not able to say, well, we've got this benefit from talking to the West, because they haven't.
Yeah, I think that's
just to go back one stage, Bette and Christina, just before we launch into the present and the return of the Taliban, is how they managed to get rid of this government. I'm not talking about the final moment, but how come that they were able to seize so much of Afghanistan? Even as early as 2006, 2007, they were controlling great chunks of the countryside. Why was that?
I think that really is unfortunately the result of Hamid Karzai's work with the Americans. There was really a lot of hope after the fall, and the Taliban also they surrendered. The top didn't want to fight anymore. Mullah brother lived for a long time in Derawood, for example, and some went to have telephone shops in Pakistan. The threat of the Taliban was gone for 4 years. Instead, without the threat being very low, you see an increase of American troops. The question we have to ask, who did they kill? And they lined up with the warlords. I prefer not to use the word, but it's now not a lot of time. But they lined up with the warlords. They gave them their information, like, do you want to kill Taliban? Fine, here in this valley, go. And they pointed at rivals. They pointed at family member rivalry, or for money, or for drugs, or whatsoever. So I would almost say that in the first 4 years, we consequently killed the wrong people. And in any country, this will create an insurgency.
So I have a slightly different,
go for it.
I wrote a whole book about the mistakes that the West made. So I definitely feel it's our fault, really, for the most part, what happened, but not completely. But where I differ from Bette is I think things started happening earlier than that. Basically the war in Iraq in 2003 was seen. So up until then, from 2001, the Taliban had been very quiet in Quetta. I mean, they were there openly, and I went and interviewed some of the Taliban ministers there, and so nobody was really bothering about them. The war in Afghanistan wasn't fighting the Taliban then. It was more about sort of peacekeeping in theory, and there were very few troops. There was only about 5,000 Western troops. People used to say, this is ridiculous for the size of this country. How can you have so few troops? But in 2003, when the war in Iraq happened, the Taliban and maybe their ISI backers saw this as a great opportunity. And that's when people started drifting back already. By 2005, it was really happening a lot.
In 2005, you had ISI and Pakistani army trucks delivering them to the border. I mean, it was very clear.
Unfortunately, you know, the West made a lot of mistakes. I mean, we would be here weeks if we started talking about more. But the principal one, I think, was that we were basically fighting to protect a government that was very unpopular. And really, as long ago as 2005, 2006, when I was traveling around, people were saying to me, the biggest problem in our life is the Afghan government, that they're corrupt, they're nepotistic, anything we try and do, any activity, we're having to pay bribes, and people are hassling us. So, you know, it was never going to be a successful position. So, so it's a combination of the Afghan politicians and government behaving badly. So it's not just the West's fault, but also that the West was trying to promote this group, which was very unpopular. And we never really understood who we were fighting. And we, you know, often, I think Bette writes about this, but a lot of the initial fighting, at least, was, you know, tribal conflicts between different groups. And we were labeling it all as Taliban. So we made the Taliban look more powerful than they actually were. And
so
they weren't
Gilzai against Durrani and Gilzai against Popalzai in old conflicts under the guise of new flags.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Bette, how far do you think that Biden destroyed Ashraf Ghani's government by that withdrawal? Would it have fallen anyway? Was it just a matter of time? Or do you think the manner of the American withdrawal made the collapse a fact?
I think I was not there in Afghanistan, but I think that the Americans had maneuvered themselves in a very, like, they had created the situation for themselves that they could not leave properly anymore. For years, they knew that. The whole discussion about the withdrawal never ended. It was, you know, like a global script that we all wrote about, and I found it extremely boring because it wasn't. There was not a real way out anymore. They had created so many enemies. So. Yeah, Biden did it this way. I think any other way, but I'm not sure what Christina thinks, any other way would have been disastrous too. So,
I mean, look, the fact is, back in 2001, when all this started, if anyone had said to us that the American troops were going to be there 20 years, we would never have believed it. I mean, so I think there always was going to be a point when they left, whether they really needed to go completely or whether they could have left a small force. I mean, they were taking very few casualties in recent times. So, you know, it's a question, but they had been sort of painted into a corner by the peace deal that Trump had signed. What I would say is the way Biden's administration did it, though. I mean, they just, you know, pulled out very quickly with not planning. I think the Ghani government somehow didn't have a plan B. Their plan B was that somehow the Americans would stay and they would persuade them to stay. So they hadn't properly prepared for what to do. But, you know, it wasn't just that the American forces left, it was all the logistics, all the contractors, all the support, the air support, the intelligence, and the army that the West had helped train was an army that was dependent on all these things. It was an army maybe it was the wrong kind of army for Afghanistan. It wasn't really an Afghan type army. It was like a Western army, and therefore was reliant on having these things, which was suddenly
software engineers and contractors and people running the computer systems and all this, none of which was ever in Afghan hands.
And they were just, pulled away almost overnight within a couple of weeks.
Christina, we have literally 1 more minute. Just paint a picture of the situation now. You were there a couple of weeks ago. What's how bad is it?
It's so harrowing. I mean, in some ways, I was there just after the Taliban took over in September and October. And then it was really shocking, because everybody was in shock. People just didn't know what had hit them. And there were Taliban everywhere and no women to be seen. Most things were shut. This time life looked a bit more normal. Things were open and there was more activity. But, people are desperate because they're not only did the foreign troops leave, but almost all foreign agencies and foreign organizations and the foreign aid. And we know the Afghan budget was 75% from foreign aid. And overnight that went, the foreign reserves were frozen. And so suddenly there was no money whatsoever. So this country has had, I've never really seen anything like it, complete economic implosion at the same time as they have the worst drought in more than 30 years, a really bitter winter with sub-zero temperatures. And, so there's nothing to turn to. Lots of people either lost their jobs or haven't been paid for months. And they don't have any way of other alternatives because there is no work, there is no harvest pretty much.
We have no more time, I'm afraid, ladies, but if you could just quickly tell us where we can read more, the names of your books so that people can go to the JLF tent and buy them. Betty first.
Well, mine is in the title of this meeting, I believe. Looking for the Enemy.
You actually have your book
it's
here.
a yellow cover. Yay! Yeah.
And Christina, you've written several Afghan books. But...
Yeah, my most recent book is called Farewell Kabul, which was actually came out a few years ago, but it does explain kind of how we got into this situation and starts with what happened under the Russians.
Thank you so very much, both of you, and it's a very grim moment to leave the story on. But thank you so much for all your expertise and bravery over so many years, both of you.
Thank you, William.
Thank you, Bette Dam, Christina Lam, and William Dalrymple for that incumbent conversation. This session is presented by Rajasthan Patrika. Thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Please stay logged on to continue to watch with us the series of exciting sessions and our JLF Writers Shorts, which have been specially curated for you.